behalf of Methods at Manchester, thanks for coming today. I'm just going to briefly introduce James. He'll give his presentation, and then there should be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end to have a discussion and for you to ask questions. James's slides will also go on the Methods at Manchester website after this as well, so you'll be able to access them from the website. So, Dr. James Rhodes is a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology. He completed his undergraduate and postgraduate studies here at Manchester before moving to the Department of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds as an ESRC postdoctoral research fellow. In 2009, James returned to Manchester to take his Simon Fellowship, which investigates deindustrialisation and dynamics of race and class in the US and the UK. Today, though, James will be speaking about ethnography and sociology.
Okay, yeah, so thanks to Claire and thanks to Methods at Manchester for asking me to come and talk about ethnography and sociology. So as Claire said, I'm using an ethnographic approach for the study of deindustrialisation, kind of community formation and, like I said, dynamics of race and class in a town in America and Burnley in the UK. And it's the first time I've ever actually used an ethnographic, a strictly sort of ethnographic approach. So it's kind of relatively new to me. So I'm hoping this is a useful sort of introductory talk in relation to some of the kind of overarching issues around ethnography, and also from some sort of personal reflections of some of the things, I found useful about using it and some of the challenges of using ethnography as well. I mean, ethnography doesn't have a really sort of strict definition. It's generally recognised as a kind of complementary use of sort of mixed methods that's particularly interested in accessing the kind of complexity of life and recognising how social relations are sort of embedded in specific contexts. And that's my particular interest in why I employ an ethnographic approach. So there's just a few things to pick out of this quote here. I think the interesting thing is about it involves the ethnographer participating. So it differs from just using an interview approach in that you're not just interested in what people say, you're also interested in what they do. And in light of that, you're also interested in you yourself participating in the activities that people do. So in the research I've done in America, this has involved kind of, for the various projects I'm involved in, going to like boxing matches, hanging around in a boxing gym, like local neighbourhood bars, and also attending like community meetings and like community sort of clean-up events and things like that. So it can involve a kind of range of different participatory activities. And again, I think the thing is as well, it's about people's daily lives for an extended period of time. And that's one of the things, again, that distinguishes it from other research methods is the kind of length of immersion in the research setting. You spend a long amount of time trying to get to know the participants, trying to get an understanding of their sort of daily lives and routines and relations from their point of view, which is really important. It's about the idea of developing a sort of insider account as much as you ever can sort of become an insider. So again, it involves watching what happens, listening to what is said, and also asking questions in relation to this. And we'll come back to this a bit later. And also, again, collecting whatever data are available at the time. So it's not necessarily just observing and just talking to people. You're also interested in collecting text around it. So an example of some of the things I did was collected kind of like neighbourhood flyers, agendas from community meetings. And also I took a number of photographs of like buildings, particular signs, and even actually on some occasions like the T-shirts people wore that were sort of locally made that I used as kind of text. So it involves like a kind of range of approaches. And Karen O'Reilly offers what she calls like a minimal definition of ethnography. This is what ethnography ultimately is constituted by. So she talks about an inductive approach to research. So in other words, it's not about kind of testing a pre-existing theory. It's about how theoretical insights emerge from the research that you conduct. So in that sense, it's seen as being kind of more data-led than sort of theory-led. That shouldn't mean that you're not aware of the theory around it, because obviously, you generally have a prior insight into the theory that exists in an area when you're formulating your research questions, deciding where to conduct the research. But it's the idea that you're not testing fixed hypotheses. It's the idea that the kind of theories emerge from the data and the experiences you observe and analyse. And as I've already mentioned, it's related to like a family of methods, a mixed methods approach, or it's sometimes called triangulation. The principal method within ethnography is often participant observation. So observing events by participating in them. But it also traditionally involves like interviews, whether sort of structured, semi-structured, more formal sit-down interviews that are recorded, or more informal conversations that you then just make notes on. And also it can involve the collection of kind of statistical data. So in my own research, I often use like census information, and I also And in this project, I'm using significant like archival research. So I'm going back and looking at reports that are based on the two communities I'm looking at, and looking at newspaper articles over a certain period of time. So again, it can be kind of a range of methods that you use. As I said, it involves direct and sustained contact with the people that you're kind of studying. And importantly, it's within the context of their daily lives. You know, you're trying to observe what they do in terms of habits, routines, practices, daily activities. So as I said, it's about watching what happens, listening to what is said, asking questions. And then another thing which really appeals to me as kind of a reader of academic books is the kind of rich accounts that can be produced through ethnography. I mean, I generally find ethnographies are so enjoyable to read if they're done well, far more so I'd say than any other kind of data that any other research method generates. They're just really enjoyable to read. And again, that respects the irreducibility of human experience. I think this is about the recognition that the account that you produce is kind of a construction, a particular representation of events. It's not that we're ever going to be able to explain the full or the reality of what's going on. It's that we observe a particular facet of that and we interpret it in our own particular way. So it's not that human experience is necessarily accessible for us to objectively record and then regurgitate. It's about that in the process of doing this research, we adopt particular positions, particular perspectives. We are privy to only specific things. That means we produce kind of partial accounts that are never kind of fully capture the nature of human experience. And that's another important thing to recognise. And also that it acknowledges the role of theory. One of the kind of criticisms of ethnography is that it's simply glorified journalism. So one of the things that that you want to do is develop theoretical insights and engage with theories through the data that you were able to obtain. And as well, it's also about being really reflective on the role of the researcher. You know, I know that as in terms of the research I've done, particularly in America, no one else in this room would have the same research experiences, would be able to generate the same data. So in this sense, we have to think about our own role within it. You know, how have we co-produced the kind of data that we're coming out with? How is our particular, our age, our gender, class, race, how has this impacted upon our ability to access certain settings and the type of material that we're able to find within those? And that is a massively important thing. That's one of the key things of ethnography, is reflecting on the role of the researcher within the ethnography itself. And again, it's recognising that humans are kind of part object, part subject. It's that people, have a degree of agency, but there are also kind of constraints on these actions. And again, this is why sort of statistical data is really important. When you're looking at a neighbourhood, it's important to contextualise people's actions within the constraints of a particular setting. So, in the town I'm looking at in America, I understand that the social actions that go on are occurring within a context of massive population decline, a disproportionately high murder rate and crime rate, massive levels of poverty, one of the poorest cities in America. So these are the kind of things as well that you're recognising that actions and practices are embedded in particular contexts and settings, and it's about trying to understand those settings and contexts and how they inform and kind of mediate the actions of people. In terms of the historical origins of the method, so it emerged primarily through social anthropology, which, as we know, was particularly interested in kind of studying distinct tribes and the sort of distinct cultures, institutions and practices that went on within those tribal communities. And again, it's not necessarily new. It happened, travel writers, journalists, all these people had been engaged in what was essentially ethnography, the idea of living with a group of people for a long period of time and developing accounts. What differed for people like Malinowski was that they thought it could be like an academic pursuit and that you could apply a degree of rigour to it. So this was rigour in terms of meticulously detailing what you saw, what methods you used to do it, and trying to construct kind of theories out of what you observe. So he saw ethnography as a methodological approach, which the key goals of which were to use concrete statistical documentation to record the organisation of the tribe and the anatomy of its culture. So Malinowski felt that tribes had their own kind of social order and social structure, but it was only by spending time with those groups, a prolonged period of time, and becoming ingratiated into their daily routines that you were able to see this kind of structure within those societies. So it was about observing that and then being able to describe it. As you can see, to use minute detailed observations to log, sort of every aspect of daily life. And also to collect a range of other materials. So maps we use, like statements of people, photographs, life histories, things like that. Well, in terms of the origins within sociology, this very much emerged within the tradition of the Chicago School. in America. And obviously the main difference with sociology is that it's about the study of ordinary life. So it wasn't necessarily interested in the study of kind of remote tribes. It was actually interested in, the places in which we're embedded. So the Chicago School, as you can see, saw the local community as kind of a laboratory for research, for experimentation, and for kind of academic analysis. And they also sort of developed the use of fieldwork and observational methods in relation to the various communities of Chicago. So they produced studies about the Jewish ghetto, Polish immigrants, about the homeless, juvenile delinquency. So there's this idea of applying methods that have previously been used to study kind of remote and distant communities to actually study in your own community. And again, it employed a multi-method approach. So mapping was seen as a kind of quantitative technique, and we're all probably aware of the famous kind of like ecology maps of the city that the Chicago School produced. So they used things like mapping, they used census data, things like imprisonment rates, things like this, alongside kind of observation, participation, life histories, and things like face-to-face interviews as well. And you can see here, it was this idea, this is typical of an ethnographic approach, like an openness to people, data, places, and theory, which is seen as kind of intrinsic to the ethnographic process. And I like this quote from Robert Park. So he says, how the conventional view was that you got your hands dirty in libraries and in archives, and that was the way to do research. But he said what you really needed to do was get the seat of your pants dirty by actually going out into the world, into the communities in which you were embedded, and studying social phenomena within them. I think that's a kind of nice quote to summarise that method and its appeal for many people. I mean, certainly this is, like I said, the first time I've done an ethnographic study, and it is incredibly enjoyable, compared to a more traditional qualitative interviewing approach. The ability to actually go and live in a setting, to sort of forge relationships and to kind of develop an understanding is like incredibly enjoyable and exciting as well. So I was asked as well to talk in sort of very non-technical terms about how it works. So I suppose in a sense, ethnography is no different from any other research method or project. So you begin with kind of your research design, then it's about the actual carrying out of the research, the practice, it's about the collation of the data and its analysis, and then it's about kind of writing up the findings. So in this sense, ethnography is no different from any other method, but obviously there are certain kind of specifics to this approach. So obviously, in terms of your research design, you start with the usual questions. What are you interested in? What do you think you might find? What methods will you use? Obviously, as I said, ethnography is usually a mixed method approach. So it's not that you'll necessarily just use observation on its own. You have to decide, A, what type of observation you'll do, and we'll come back to this, but also what other methods you'll use alongside this. So in my own current project, as well as participant observation, I chose to use life history interviews as my kind of principle of the method alongside archival research. I was particularly interested in kind of like the biographies of people. Because I'm interested in kind of processes of social change and deindustrialization, I wanted a kind of longitudinal historical perspective, why people had moved where they had done, their kind of career trajectories, and how that kind of informed the activities they engage with in the community, and also their attitudes and ideas. And also, like, what you already know on the subject, you should have, prior to any topic, you should have developed a reasonable understanding of it through the relevant literature in order to kind of formulate your specific areas of interest, to try and address kind of gaps in the existing literature. So this kind of helps you to decide, and also to think about where are appropriate sites and places to do research as well. And then finally, you want to think about, and this is a broader issue with ethnography, and this idea that when you're focusing on such kind of limited spaces and limited communities, how can that method ever be sort of representative of broader phenomena? Well, obviously, ethnography isn't designed, it isn't a method. If you're seeking to establish high generalizability of findings, high representativity, then you're not necessarily going to use ethnography. But it's about how can you, is there a broader set of literature which you can situate your findings in? Are there kind of political debates that are going on that you can situate your findings in? You have to think about how is it relevant and how might it relate to things that are happening in other settings. I think that's really important as well to consider, partly just practically as a researcher. You want your research to have an impact. You want to be able to make connections to other things that are going on. So I think that's an important consideration when you embark upon it. And again, you have to also really think about the context in which your research will be based. So obviously settings in terms of the specific place. In terms of Burnley and Youngstown in America, the two places I've looked at, Burnley is one of the few places in England that shares some of the problems that Youngstown does in terms of significant levels of housing vacancy, population decline, depressed housing market, large-scale kind of deindustrialization. So in that sense, the actual setting itself can sometimes be relatively straightforward. But then you also have to think about what actual settings are you going to study within the community itself. So an example of this was one of the places I managed to get access to was this neighbourhood bar, but there were certain issues around this. It was in a very poor part of the city with a very high murder rate. And because of this, the bar was swipe card only to get in. It was a members only club to try and keep it safe. So I was aware in a sense that, you know, I'm only mixing with a very certain group of people. You know, it was predominantly white in a neighbourhood that's predominantly African American. You know, there were a range of other factors around it. And also the time of day is really important. Like, what time are you going to study? And this again happened in this bar. I tended to go into the bar between kind of like 4 and 7 in the evening, which was like the after work crowd. You got a lot of people that just finished work, went into the bar. And the dynamics were completely different. Occasionally I went in much later at night and it was a completely different crowd. Sometimes I didn't even recognize anyone of the early evening crowd that were going later. And then one time or a few times I went in on a Sunday, and my assumption that this was a primarily white bar, which it was most of the time. One time I went in on a Sunday and the bar was full of African American guys that had been playing golf previously. So, you know, it's also about the times in which you engage in a setting as well. That's really important to consider, you know, and this is again about the kind of recognition that we're only kind of getting snapshots of life. As much as we might be embedded in a context, it's a particular version of events, it's a particular reading and perspective on events that we have. And also the type of people you engage with. As I said, a lot of the kind of contacts that I made through this bar, they sort of placed themselves as slightly higher up in a hierarchy of bars that went along this road. You know, they saw themselves as kind of the respectable working class. A lot of them were kind of skilled manual workers. So again, in terms of the types of people I was getting, it wasn't necessarily a representative sample of the neighbourhood in which this bar was embedded. And I think it's really important to recognise that as well. That, you know, that you're dealing with specific contexts that aren't necessarily representative. You're going in there at particular times, which is really important. Because when you go in at other times, you realise how important the actual rhythms and timing of your research is. And as I said, you're engaging with people that, again, aren't necessarily representative of the wider community. So it's really important to kind of acknowledge these things and be reflexive about them, you know, but have an idea of who are the target people that you want to engage with. Similarly, another way I made a lot of contacts was through attending neighbourhood meetings. At neighbourhood meetings, the people were generally kind of politically engaged homeowners in neighbourhoods that were increasingly full of renters rather than homeowners. So again, you have to recognise that you're getting a particular cohort of people, and you have to reflect on how representative that is and your reasons for accessing those kinds of people as well. And sometimes pragmatics can come into this. Sometimes it's simply that, you know, when you're going into a new place, you want to go through kind of existing institutional structures, existing kind of channels, and that means that you're steered in particular ways. So again, we have to be kind of aware of these things. And access can be really important as well. The things you read on ethnography, you'll often hear to talk about kind of really important gatekeepers. I was lucky in that I established connections with who became a really important gatekeeper for me very early on. So one of the studies I'm looking at is the representations that surround this world champion boxer that is from Youngstown, ex-world champion boxer. And I was lucky enough to get in touch with his agent to arrange access for me to go to fights and go into the gym and things. And it turned out that he became a really important person that led me into a range of other interactions, because it's a very racially segregated city. And someone one day told me he's the only white person that can go into any black bar in the city. So I asked him about this and he said, yeah, I'll show you. And from then on, he started taking me to African-American bars, which would have been very difficult for me to access without him sort of introducing me to people. So again, access is really important, but also you have to recognise that the people you meet will direct your research and steer you in particular ways. And there can also be complications in terms of managing the relationships you have with gatekeepers, particularly if you might have to be kind of critical about some of the views like they kind of put forward. So again, there can be quite sort of tricky issues of negotiating relationships as well, particularly when you're spending a prolonged period of time in a particular setting. Sort of visually, these are the kind of key sort of methods that you'll use and the kind of key kinds of data that you'll end up with. So I'm going to talk about Louis Wacquant and his study of a boxing gym in Chicago. But he talks about how he ended up with over 2,000 pages of field notes just from his period of work in the gym. So you can end up with incredible amounts of data. Like I have lever arch files and PDF files full of like newspaper articles, literally like probably thousands of pages. I have around 1,000 pages of newspaper articles about the boxer. On top of that, I have hundreds of pages of transcripts and hundreds of pages of field notes. So you kind of do develop significant amounts of data within this. And again, I've got loads of images as well. I've got massive amounts of like photographs, sort of tickets, you know, flyers, things like this. There's a range of material that you'll end up collating in the process of it. And again, in terms of formal and informal interviews, I tended to take a much more formal interview approach. So I didn't really tend to just chat with people on a one-to-one basis and then make notes. I tended to like ask them if I could come and speak to them, you know, in a private setting like their home and actually record the interviews. I wanted to do that. And it's also interesting in terms of what people prefer to do. Some people, when I got to the house, said, well, let's take a drive. So I ended up actually recording the interviews in the car as we were driving around particular places, which again was kind of an interesting thing. And I think you have to be prepared to some degree, you know, to be flexible and to kind of just roll with, you know, what people want you to do. And that can be really important too. Again, there are different kind of observational roles that you can assume. The kind of, most people's position falls somewhere in the middle. It's very unlikely that you would be a complete observer or a complete participant. I mean, to be a complete participant, you'd have to do the research covertly. In other words, you would have to not tell the people involved what you were actually doing there. So in that sense, it would be much easier to do that if you were already in an institution. So an example of that would be like Simon Holdaway, who did a study of racism within the British police force, who was actually a police officer based within that. And again, people have argued that the kind of complete observer isn't actually possible, because just by our very presence of observing, we are kind of participating and we're influencing, you know, the surroundings that we're observing and the actions that take place. And again, it's often not the case that these things are desirable. In terms of a complete participant, you're very much then going to be steered by like group norms and expectations of what you should do when you do that job. And also your ability to ask questions is going to be severely curtailed. You know, it's going to look very odd if you start interrogating everyone that you work with about particular issues. You know, it's not going to seem natural. So in a way, you want to be able to, you know, state your position clearly and then be able to ask them kind of reflective questions about what they do, ask them to reflect on their practices, which wouldn't necessarily be possible if you were sort of a complete participant. And equally, if you're a complete observer, you know, you're not going to be able to kind of engage or participate in any of the things that people do, or kind of directly engage them in terms of interviews and things like that. In terms of analysing ethnographic data, so Brewer states that there are kind of a number of key steps. So obviously, when you have the amounts of data that you're likely to generate, you have to kind of manage it and organise it in a logical fashion. So this can be done increasingly through like computer software, sort of particularly for interviews and transcripts, things like that, or even newspaper articles where you can code things thematically or by particular recurring subjects that come up and categorise it in that way. You also might do a content analysis, so combine more kind of quantitative and qualitative methods in terms of the analysis. You might be looking for the frequency of words within particular things, or again, you might be more interested in themes that emerge within kind of newspaper reports, textual reports, kind of policy documents, things like that you might have collected. Another key thing, and this again is what I think makes ethnographic accounts so rich, is the description. You know, you want to be able to describe key events, you want to be able to describe who are some of the key actors involved in this, what are some of the practices that you observed, and what are some of the ideas. I mean, I'll talk on this, but Wacquant does an excellent section where he just observes. I mean, the third of this book is just about a 24-hour period leading up to a boxing card, and his observations of the weigh-in, the fight, everything that gets done. And I think that's another real strength of ethnographic data. It can mix and match. You know, it can focus on particular events as kind of indicative of some of these broader practices. And I think that can come across really well in terms of the depth of understanding and the depth of analysis. But as I said, it's important to retain a role for theory so that it doesn't lapse into kind of just, you know, journalism basically. And as I said, you want to look for recurring themes and patterns in the data. You know, you want to kind of develop theoretical insights from the material that you've gathered. You know, you want to develop categories and classifications and typologies. This is something you'll often see that emerges from ethnographic data, in that people identify kind of different types of people or different types of setting or different types of institutional practices and try and kind of like group them together in that way. So that can be a really useful thing to do. And I think also another thing that I really like about ethnography is, particularly when I'm looking at issues around like racism, is you get to incorporate contradictions. You know, a lot of the time in sociology or in any kind of academic research, we're looking at explaining the dominant trends. But I think the good thing about ethnography is it allows you to also look at the exceptions to these things. You know, why do these arise? And it's about not writing that complexity out of your account. It's about kind of incorporating it into it. And I think that's really valuable as well within ethnographic research, particularly when you're dealing with, I mean, an example of this is, I mean, some of the things that people will tell you about in relation to like race and race relations on tape differs greatly from the things that I would then hear them say in the bar. And even practices, you know, one guy, for instance, told me, you know why this bar is swipe card only, don't you? So I said, oh, no. And he said, well, it's to keep the blacks out. You know, if you hear that in isolation, but then a few days before, I'd seen him help a black regular in the bar fix his car in the car park. So again, it's about kind of incorporating complexity. And I think through prolonged study and seeing people over a prolonged period of time allows you to do that. And I think that, again, that's really important as well. And Brewer also talks about like how to write up ethnographic accounts. So he talks about you want to describe the context. And I think that's really important. You know, you really want to take people to the setting that you've been in. You know, what makes that place the place it is, you know, bring people into it. And I think that's really important. And the best ethnographies, particularly Wacquant, I'm going to talk about, does that really well. He really takes you into the setting that he's describing. And that's really, really important thing to do. Also, you want to talk about who were the people you interviewed. You know, who were they? What were the characteristics of them? How did you encounter them? And also, most ethnographic studies will tend to have, as I talked about in terms of my gatekeeper, they'll often have key participants that they refer to more than kind of anyone else often within the text. And that's important as well that you do that. And identify as well, why were they so important to the research? That's really important. You want to document the activities that you were involved in and the activities that go on in the community. What do people do? Your understandings and their perceptions of why they do it, the sort of behaviours and activities. And also the time and order of the research. Again, timing is very important in terms of when did you observe particular settings, both in terms of the period, as in when it was in a year, what year was it, but also the times of day, the times of month, which can make a really big difference in terms of your findings. You want to establish some idea of routines. You know, what were the kind of habitual activities that people engaged in? What were some kind of recurring trends and themes that occurred within the things that you observed? And also significant events. So one event that I had was this neighbourhood bar that I did once a year. They did like a bar crawl, which was seen as like a very nostalgic thing in this neighbourhood that's increasingly dangerous, where people didn't even often want to walk to the parking lot on their own. Once a year, all of the bars joined together and had like a sort of bar crawl on the street. And again, people saw this as like a big thing, and they do 2 of them a year. And one person commented to me, "Oh, isn't it amazing? See so many white people back out in this part of town." There were literally around 400 people involved in it that just go back onto the street. So there are certain events as well that really kind of can solidify some of these things and bring some of these themes together. Another thing I went to was obviously with America's healthcare thing. One of the guys at the local bar needed cancer treatment, and they had a big fundraiser to raise money for his treatment. And so there are kind of certain really sort of specific, important kind of symbolic events that you can also incorporate into the analysis. And like I said, they can be used as kind of the prism through which you can kind of articulate some of the broader themes that have come out of the research. And obviously, you want to include the members' perceptions themselves. You know, so obviously it's useful to have transcripts of interviews. You want it not to be solely your words. You know, you should manage the analysis, and it should be you making the points. But you want to incorporate people's perceptions and views to substantiate those points. And again, that's one of the great things about ethnography, and that the kind of reams of data you have and the richness of it means that you should be able to do this kind of really well. And as I've already mentioned, I think it's important as well to recognise the kind of variety of voices. You know, you don't want to suppress diversity in the accounts, and you don't want to suppress difference. You know, the key thing about ethnography is bringing that difference to the table and making that a key aspect of your research findings. And also a really important part is that you reflect on your own practices. You know, you reflect on, you know, the limitations of the methods, the particular version of events that you got. Again, the implications in terms of extending your findings to other settings. You really have to be very critical about the practices you've engaged in, how the project was designed, what are the advantages and disadvantages is of how you did it and the types of data you were able to obtain. I mean, so when do we use ethnography? So you usually use it when you want an in-depth understanding. So as I said, I'm interested in kind of like dynamics of race and class in a deindustrialized setting. So, I mean, to do that by interviews alone would be really difficult to do. And similarly, just to look at census data, to look at the kind of changing incomes and racial composition of the city, again, wouldn't really necessarily give me a very sort of in-depth perspective of that. So I'm interested in practices like how do people enact ideas of community? You know, how do they mobilize ideas of community around things like neighbourhood block watches and community groups, things like that. Urban gardening and allotments was also another thing that I observed. So you're interested in kind of, you know, things that aren't directly accessible, aren't kind of readily observable. And again, I suppose to some degree, I'm coming at it from, there's this idea of like standpoint ethnography or standpoint epistemology where it's kind of inherently political and people have a particular perspective. And you can often be drawn into this more than you would necessarily imagine at the outset. So one of the things, by attending neighbourhood meetings, I became increasingly aware of some of the kind of problems that were going on in relation to city government and how neighbourhoods. And so me and a guy I was working with over there decided to write a piece about this that would be an internet-only piece. And it subsequently got a lot of play, and we ended up having to go on like radio. He went on TV news to talk about it. And so in a way, we also, towards the end of my fieldwork period, I almost came to be seen as kind of an advocate for kind of neighbourhood concerns. And I mean, that it can be a part of ethnography, but it can also be an issue because, you know, as I'm thinking about going back and wanting to re-interview or interview for the first time members of the city administration because my research has gone, now my name's kind of blacklisted in that because of my involvement with this article. So again, you have to think carefully about, you know, the nature of your engagement, when these things should come out. I think, you know, again, that's just another practical example of some of the issues that can be come along when doing ethnography. And again, you're also interested in the meanings that social actors themselves construct. You know, and as I said, it's not only about what they say or what they say they do, it's also about actually observing what they do, which is really important. And again, I think it's a particularly useful method where there's a degree of ambiguity or ambivalence around things. So by looking at kind of how people talk about race and how they talk about identity and community in this way, I was able to get across some of the contradictions. You know, you could initially write off people that would say, you know, initially some of the people you'd met, you could get the impression that, oh, all blacks are terrible. But then the more that you knew them, the more and you talked to them, the more you were able to recognise that they made certain kind of sophisticated, you know, distinctions, and they had kind of quite complex views about when race did matter, when it didn't, and how they were able to sort of negotiate the significance of race. And I think again that's really important about spending a prolonged period of time in a setting and being kind of embedded within it. I better sort of move along a bit more quickly. So the types of understanding it gives us, you know, it's the kind of richness of the data and accounts. It allows for complexity and ambiguity. It's about engaging social actors in their natural settings and seeing social relations as kind of embedded and informed through particular contexts. It's also about being reflexive, about recognising our own role within the production of the research and how we ourselves are essentially constructing a particular representation and a particular version of the events and practices that we observed. And also from this, it's hoped that kind of new theoretical insights will emerge. I suppose in terms of some of the challenges of ethnography, obviously it's very time consuming and it's very reliant on you as an individual. As I said, even if you're working as a team, it's very unlikely that someone else will be able to access or will get the same findings or establish the same relationships that you were able to. So that's another really important consideration. Access can be very difficult, you know, particularly if you want to observe institutions or work within particular settings, companies, things like corporations, that can be very difficult to obtain. And again, there's also the real importance in maintaining objective or what's sometimes called like critical distance. You know, you don't want the danger of what's seen as like going native. And I think it's really important to recognise however much you might think you're inside, you can never be fully inside. You know, you are never kind of in that life. You are observing in it, you are participating in it, but you're not of it. And that's really important to remember. And that can become entangled when you develop friendships with some of the participants that might extend well beyond the period of fieldwork. You know, it's important to maintain that sense of like critical distance. Again, the challenge can be the role of interpretation. You know, we recognise that we're putting a particular angle and spin on what people have said, and then you do have a responsibility. you know, you want to maintain the kind of your own integrity and the kind of good faith in which those comments or materials were given to you without sacrificing any kind of your, you know, your critical analysis and theoretical engagement. And again, there are certain like ethical dilemmas in terms of consent. You know, obviously, if you're kind of writing up snippets of exchanges, you know, there are issues around like informed consent. Then, how do you get consent? Are the people that are involved and written into your findings fully aware of how that material is going to subsequently be used? So I'm just going to have to be very quick. But like two kind of probably my favourite ethnographies. One of them is Loic Wacquant's Body and Soul: Notebooks of an Apprentice Boxer, where he studied a boxing gym on the south side of Chicago, and he saw it primarily as like a lens into ghetto life, but he subsequently, as he will admit, became kind of seduced by the world of boxing, and he actually ended up having an amateur bout. So he actually fought in the Chicago Golden Gloves contest in 1990. He lost, kind of unsurprisingly, but you know, it's the fact he trained for years and went through this and participated in it. I mean, a lot of the people that are focused on this book are really interested in kind of the explanation of the craft of boxing, which is fascinating. But the kind of bit I was more interested in is the relationship he talks about between the gym and the ghetto. You know, recognizing the gym as this institution that he talked about it being kind of the ghetto, but also constructed in opposition to it. And it's just, again, a fascinating insight into recognizing how sort of particular social contexts and institutions are shaped by the broader surroundings, and how they often sit both, you know, in relation to and also sometimes in opposition to these broader surroundings. Again, I can't recommend it highly enough. I think one of the best things about Wacquant's this book, again, is just the quality of the writing, and you know, it completely takes you into that world. I read a review of it recently again where an academic had lent it to a friend of his who'd used to box, and he said the descriptions of the kind of sparring that took him right back to his days of when he was boxing. You know, and it intersperses kind of sociological text with more kind of like verbatim reproductions of field notes, which again is a really good format. And it's also divided in three ways. So the first third, is about the ghetto and its relation to the boxing gym and its relation to the ghetto. The second part is, like I said, the description of a 24-hour period leading up to a fight card. And the third part of the book is about his own experience of fighting in the Chicago Golden Gloves. So it's a really sort of fascinating book. I'm going to have to move through these quickly. And another one, obviously, in relation to my research interest that I really like, is Monica McDermott, who did this book, Working Class White. And she actually worked for 2 6-month periods as a checkout clerk in two convenience stores in America, one in Atlanta and one in Boston. And again, I think McDermott book, I don't think it's written as kind of elegantly as Wacquant's, but I think it's really interesting in relation to some of the challenges posed by gaining access, and also about how ethnographic research can not only raise interesting theoretical insights, but challenge your own kind of preconceptions. So she said she went into these kind of poorer neighborhoods, predominantly white, but becoming more multiracial, multi-ethnic, with this idea of kind of white privilege as this sort of thing that she carried around with her. And she said she found that white privilege kind of didn't matter at all in these neighborhoods, and it was actually in many ways like a form of stigma. She said that because she was working in a convenience store and because she was living in like a poorer neighborhood, people often made assumptions about her in terms of like drug use, mental health. And there are also issues about how open she was. So she makes it clear that in order to even get one of the jobs, she wrote that she was interested in studying economic restructuring. She didn't say that she was interested in race relations, and she told some of her co-workers that she was interested in economic restructuring. But then in the other grocery store that she was able to access a job, she doesn't make it clear, you know, the extent to which she revealed to her co-workers. So there are issues around kind of, you know, how kind of overt or covert conditions this research was conducted in. But again, I think it's a very interesting study in terms of getting at the complexities of social relations. And she does that really well through this kind of 12-month period that she spent working in these settings. Finally, just a few. So obviously there's a couple of key academic journals which you can access online, like Ethnography and the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography. And there are a number of websites. The Centre for Urban Ethnography at Berkeley, which Wacquant is a member of, is really good. It actually lists all the academic publications that have been produced by people within the centre, which you can then access, and that's really useful. And you can look at kind of ongoing projects that they're involved in. And here's just a list of some kind of key, very introductory readings to sort of ethnography in the the practices of carrying out ethnographic research.